Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is in our not-for-profit webinar series and we're going to focus on pay compliance and something called wage theft. Now we are bang on start time and I can see the number of attendees climbing pretty quickly, so I think we might make a start. Now at a reasonably high level, these are the things that we intend to cover today. So we're going to talk about wage theft. What it is, what it means for not-for-profits in particular. And after that, we're going to talk about what wage compliance really looks like in an environment of awards and EBAs. We're going to talk about the compliance landscape and we're going to talk about some of the risks around this whole area. But before we get into it, I'm just going to cover off a couple of housekeeping bits and pieces. Now hopefully you can hear me well and the sound is good. Every now and then I found with these that we do drop out very occasionally but come back very quickly, so hopefully there won't be any issues. A couple of things to note is that we are going to hopefully have some time for questions at the end, and there is a chat function available to you. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please put them into the chat function. Now what I would say with that is we'll see how we go for time. We'll answer as many questions as we can. Sometimes what we find is that questions are better taken offline and that it makes more sense to deal with them one-on-one. So if you ask a question and we don't get to it, then we will be in touch to have a conversation about it. The other thing that will happen is once this session is completed, you will get a copy of the slides and you will also get a copy of the recording if for whatever reason you decide you want to listen to it again. But hopefully the slides might be useful. Just as a refresher in the future, there's some things in there that might be helpful to you. So that's how this is hopefully going to work. As I said, I anticipate we'll talk for 40 minutes, something along those lines, leaving some time for questions at the end. And yeah, the whole session I think is intended to be an hour, so I think we'll get close to that. We'll just see how we go. By way of introduction, my name is Ben Renshaw. I'm a partner. I'm actually in the Melbourne practice. I look after our expat employment taxes and payroll compliance work. I'm also, and I put it here as well, I don't normally put it, but I've just completed quite a bit of time on a board for a not-for-profit called Melbourne Support Services. Now, Melbourne Support Services is a disability service provider. I spent the last 4 years as the chair and 6-7 years on the board. And during that time, because of the way disability has been handled in Victoria in particular, and particularly group homes, Melba went from roughly a $14 million a year organisation to a $140 million a year organisation. And while I take no credit for that, the reason I bring it up is that it does, I think, give me some insight into some of the challenges that not-for-profits face in this area and a whole host of other areas. So while there's some technical content that we're going to cover, a lot of it is from my own experience, both on from both sides, if you like, from sitting on the board of a not-for-profit and being involved there, but also doing this sort of work for not-for-profit clients. I'm also joined by Holly Harper. Holly is a senior manager in a Brisbane practice who also does extensive work with the not-for-profit sector around risk management and risk reviews for payroll, pay compliance, those sorts of things. So while I'll do much of the talking today, Holly is going to talk also going to talk about some of the work that she does and some of the things that she's seen as well. So hopefully between us, we can provide some interesting insights. So with that, I will kick off, and it may seem a little bit obvious, but I think it's worth just spending a few minutes on. Wage theft is a term that gets thrown around quite extensively and has done for the past few years. And I think it's worth just spending a minute understanding where that comes from, what it means, how it's morphed over time, and just really get a sense of the importance of it from each of your sort of perspectives. So what I've done here is I have taken sort of 3 almost definitions or discussion points at least around wage theft and where the terms come from. Now, I think the really important thing to note is that wage theft is a term that was heavily thrown around in the press and the political sphere, and as I say, the media extensively pre-COVID, a lot. During COVID, not too much, but we're starting to see it resurface. And while it probably originally started in the hospitality and retail sector, and certainly that's where our work started in this space, more and more you're seeing this term applied to a broad spectrum of companies, of sectors, of organizations. So what I've done here is, as I say, I've taken three areas, and the first one comes from the Queensland government and is effective with their official definition. And I will take a moment just to read it because I think it is quite important. So wage theft can take various forms, such as the deliberate underpayment of wages, having entitlements such as leave and penalty rates deliberately withheld, and an employer deliberately not making required superannuation contributions on an employee's behalf. Now, that seems like a reasonably good definition to me, and what I take from that in particular, and this is something we'll come back to a little later on in the session, is that in that sentence, the word deliberate or deliberately is in there 3 times. So I think what that says to me is that very clearly government, state and federal legislature understands that what they're focused on here primarily is a deliberate act to underpay or underpay, as I say, wages or penalty rates or superannuation or whatever it might be. Certainly the government official definition, wage theft, it requires that deliberate act for wage theft to be committed. But then I move on to the second quote that I pulled out for you, which was taken from the Sydney Morning Herald from a couple of writers who focus extensively on this also. And their view is that wage theft describes the practice of paying workers less than they're entitled to under Australia's workplace relations system. And this is a really common definition or sort of approach or stance that you see in the media whenever they talk about this wage theft issue and this worker rights issue. Now, the obvious difference between those two things is that there's no focus, no thought as to whether the underpayment of employees has been deliberate, accidental, inadvertent. It doesn't come into that definition at all. And while it's not an official definition, it is the wording or the approach or the intent that we sort of see from the media when they talk about these things. The 2 individuals I've named on that particular quote are, they write extensively in this space, and they're not shy about throwing these sorts of accusations around where they feel or where they uncover that employees aren't being paid properly. And I think there's no question that all of us here and everywhere else would say employees should be paid properly the whole time, and when they're not, something needs to be done about it. Whether or not that constitutes theft, you can see here there's 2 slightly different stances on whether it does or not. And then the third little quote I've put on this page as well comes from HACSU, who the union that, you know, in this space, you guys are likely to have had a fair bit to do with or be aware of health and community services. And they take a reasonably hard line on these things as well. Obviously, the union's perspective or purpose or reason to be is to look after rights of employees. So again, they're not shy about calling out employers that are seen to not be paying their employees properly. And again, is it theft? Is it accidental? Is it inadvertent? Is it because of complexity? Is it because of a whole host of other things? I'm not sure the unions and the press at first glance care all that much. I'm not sure that the public care all that much. So the point really here is that while wage theft in and of itself requires a deliberate act in order for it to have been committed, I think you can see that from a press perspective and from a union perspective, the deliberate nature or otherwise of the act or of the problem sort of gets lost a little bit. And I think it's important that we just keep that in mind as we work through this. So while wage theft certainly sounds extreme, the view that's going to be taken by society and the media and the press and others needs to be kept in mind. And you know, my impressive Googling and cutting and pasting skills here just pull out 2 examples in the press over the last little while of not-for-profit organisations who have sort of, you know, gone into trouble. There's no 2 ways about it. Have found this area to be difficult and fallen foul of these rules. Red Cross in a significant way. An aged care employer in New South Wales mentioned there as well. And obviously these are far from the only ones. And it's, I mean, there's a few things. One is that we obviously see this in other sectors all the time. Woolies, Bunnings, Pretty much every top-end restaurant at one time or another has had a problem, and the press do go hard on those things as well. But they're also not shy of calling out other organisations, such as those in the not-for-profit space as well. I mentioned the pre and post-COVID piece here as well. I think that's quite important. I think pre-COVID, there was, and I mentioned this earlier, there was a real focus in this area. During COVID, there has been obviously existential threat to lots of organisations and businesses, which has meant things like this maybe have been toned down while more important things have been dealt with. But we are starting to see activity and focus once again. And I think as time goes on, as we hopefully come out of a COVID world, not that it feels like that's happening too quickly at the moment, but once that starts to happen, I think the focus is going to ramp up again on these sorts of challenges and problems and issues. And hopefully in a constructive way whereby some of the complexity is taken out of the system, but I think there'll be a fair bit of calling out of employers that is perceived to not be doing the right thing. I think we'll see that ramp up again as time goes on, and we'll see in a little while that sort of the compliance activity in the legislation sort of points to that as well. So it's not a problem, I think, that's going away, and it's something that we need to really be conscious of, whether it's theft or otherwise. So what I thought I might do with that in mind is just spend a little bit of time on just some of the challenges that we see, some of the challenges that organisations face in this space, and some of the things to really be focused on. Now, I think what we can't do here is get into too much detail and specific clauses of awards or EBAs, because we'd be here forever, and I think we're probably all aware that there's some complexity there. So what I sort of wanted to do is call out where this is a particular problem in my experience for the not-for-profit sector. And I put a few points on this slide that we'll spend a little bit of time on, and that will focus on a few areas sort of as we go through. Now, I think the first point here is quite important, and it sort of highlights why we sometimes see problems or errors in this space. So certainly the not-for-profits that I've been involved with, or worked for, or worked with, or helped in this space, the thing that sort of holds them together that they have in common is they tend to be very altruistic, mission-focused, values-based organisations with a huge priority and a huge premium on helping the people that they set out to help. And that goes for aged care and disability and education. They're mission-based, mission-focused organisations. And what we see is that trickles down to the workforce as well. Employees, for the most part, tend to have those same focuses, right? So they're very focused on outcomes for people you support or people you help or whatever it might be, as opposed to admin and pay and those sorts of pieces. Now, I think it's really important to understand that in the context of it being a little bit different to the other industries and areas and sectors where we see wage compliance issues being a problem. My experience is that because not-for-profits tend to be so focused rightly on the mission and the purpose, the focus and the funding and the attention that goes into back office functions, back office supports, typically underdone, often underdone. If there's money to spend, it's generally spent on achieving outcomes for clients or whatever it might be. It's not generally spent on improving processes and systems and software and those sorts of things. And I think that sort of goes all the way through through a lot of not-for-profit organisations from the board down. The priority historically certainly has been helping people, and it hasn't been software solutions or processes or fully resourcing back office functions in a way that might be necessary. Now, one thing that's clear here is that I think the press treatment that we spoke about earlier is likely to be different for organisations such as yourselves, such as this, who are out there to do good. I think there's very little sympathy some of the time for celebrity chefs, for example, whereas there's much more sympathy, I think, for organisations doing good things in society. So that offers a little bit of goodwill protection, I think, certainly, and a little bit of protection from the media. But as we saw earlier, it doesn't solve the problem by any means. And I think we still have to tackle it and deal with it, even accepting all of those things that we've said. So with that in mind, my view is that institutionalized theft in the wage theft terms is generally speaking not an issue in the not-for-profit space. It'd be unusual and unlikely to find a not-for-profit who were out there to whose focus or operating model was to underpay their staff, right? I think one thing we all know here is that traditionally the not-for-profit sector, whether it's disability, aged care, health, not highly paid industries anyway. Attracting, retaining workforces can be challenging. I don't think there's many organisations out there to screw down their employees any further. So while theft might not be an issue, I think because of the things we've already said about less focus on back office support and those sorts of things, I think compliance is a big issue because of the altruistic focus, the purpose and the mission-driven nature of not-for-profits. The focus on compliance and getting these things right hasn't maybe always been where it needs to be. The other thing I would say about this whole space, this wage theft sort of space, is that we haven't 3 years ago, 4 years ago, this wasn't an issue. It wasn't a thing that was sort of in the public or private consciousness, really. It wasn't a huge concern. There were obviously areas, occasionally you'd see things pop up here and there, but it wasn't the broad, all-consuming issue that I think it was pre-COVID and may well become again post-COVID. So I think maybe where compliance was reasonably, was not a huge focus before, and maybe that was okay. I think certainly now that focus has to change and amend. So here in a nutshell, I think are the 4 problem areas or concerns that I see when we're dealing with not-for-profits, and I think probably none of them are going to be a huge surprise. So I think we're all aware, and we'll spend a little bit more time on this, but we're all aware that the awards and the EBAs in the not-for-profit sector are complex. They're actually pretty complex in most sectors, but I think the nature of this particular sector makes them more complicated, confusing, and just difficult to understand and interpret, which I think drives some of these problems. So if you combine complexity and difficulty there with maybe under focus on this issue, then you've got a recipe, I think, potentially for some problems, some challenges. The second thing that I think drives issues or problems in this area, again, probably not a massive surprise, would be around poor business processes. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, but I think areas such as correctly rostering, correctly recording time and attendance, having that time and attendance information correctly input into a payroll system, having the payroll system correctly interpret that data with an overlay of the rules under the award and the EBAs, having the output of that checked and signed off properly to make sure it's correct, can lead to challenges. So I think end-to-end employee activity, if those processes aren't up to scratch or up to par or well looked after or well maintained, it can very quickly drive problems in this space. The third thing, which is sort of wrapped up a little bit in the second thing, is technology. Tying back to maybe an underinvestment in back office and tech and all those things that I mentioned earlier. If you don't have the technology solutions to optimally do that resourcing or take care of recording and reporting accurate time and attendance information off your staff, or ensuring that information flows through to payroll properly, all those things we just mentioned, can make things even more difficult. We see a few things. We see organizations that have almost no technology in the space, and we see organizations that have the minimum or poor or old technology which hasn't kept up with changes, but also with growth, and that's something I mentioned there as well. And the fourth thing I think that we see, and I've touched on this already, is resourcing as being a challenge. We work with a lot of clients who maybe have 1 or 2 key people in payroll, perhaps who understand the end-to-end process in detail and have come up with a way to make this work and make this work well. But the reality is, if that person is either getting it wrong, or more likely if that person leaves the business for another job, then a lot of knowledge and understanding of how to make this work in spite of the poor processes and poor technology can then walk out the door as well, and that can be hugely problematic. So we certainly see when payroll teams change or evolve, as they do, there's natural attrition there, people leave, people retire, whatever it might be. If there isn't the strength in depth in those areas, then that can be a real problem real quickly as well. And it's not just payroll, it's broader than that. It's HR's understanding of the end-to-end process. There's an IR piece there, there's a finance piece and a technology piece potentially, but making sure that those teams are resourced adequately and that there's some redundancies built in there. Some training perhaps that means people can do that people can sometimes do each other's jobs, helps to mitigate and minimize that. So as I say, they're the 4 areas that we sort of see as causing problems here: the complexity in the awards and EBAs, business processes, technology, and limited resourcing, causing real issues in a landscape that is, as I say, altruistic and mission focused rather than admin and back office focused. And I think it's magnified, certainly I've seen this in my own experience, it's magnified as organizations grow. What might have been fit for purpose 5 years ago for a smaller not-for-profit and has been furiously maintained and bolted onto and sort of band-aided as the organization has grown, sometimes you find that actually the organization's outgrown pretty quickly those processes and systems. And when an organization's growing, the focus tends to be on that growth, but again, the back office stuff sometimes gets left behind. So stable organizations that are the same year on year and have a consistent pattern of the work that they do, maybe get on top of these things better, but where growth and significant growth is involved, then these things often get magnified and highlighted. So I think if you're in an organization that's growing quickly or growing quickly, you might find that these are things that you need to focus on now because they've sort of been left behind a little bit. The other thing I thought I'd touch on here is that the focus wage theft obviously is employees not receiving the money that they should receive for their work. But we don't always find just underpayments in the work that we do. Far from it, actually. We tend to find a mixture of under and overpayments because of these same issues that we've identified. Can absolutely mean that you're paying more employee costs than you perhaps need to. And in some cases, organizations go, yeah, we're aware of that, we know that, we think that the market and the business and our employees deserve that and dictate that, and that's okay. Of course, that's okay, but I think just understanding that, I think where we see inadvertent and accidental overpayments, where the business have set themselves up to be paying people more than they need to unnecessarily, there's a couple of things happening there, right? One is that you are probably taking money away from the mission and the purpose and the goal that could be spent differently. You're also creating expectation in your employees and future employees that is difficult to backtrack on in a lot of cases. So I think it can be resolved, it can be changed going forward, but I think I wouldn't always be thinking in terms of reviewing these things from an underpayment perspective. We absolutely see overpayments happening as well, where the business just aren't aware that they're spending perhaps more than they need to on some elements of their workforce or some components of pay. So I think it's valuable to think of it from that perspective as well. Just checking time quickly. So as I said earlier, I don't think we haven't got time today, and nor would it suit a lot of people in the audience to spend a huge amount of time looking at the SHEDS Award, Social Community Home Care and Disability Services Award, which is probably the one that drives a lot of what you guys do in your businesses and or EBAs based off the SHEDS Award. Now, the SHEDS Award's a complicated beast. You can see in the title, it's got lots of different areas to it, and it covers lots of different employees and lots of different work patterns and scenarios all in one award. It's not an easy award to interpret and understand. And that is, I think, where some of these problems obviously stem from. And I think there's recognition of that to a degree. I think Fair Work would accept that. And you do see changes being made to not just this award, other awards as well, to simplify in recognition of that. But nonetheless, that's sort of what we've got to work with at the moment. And needs to be well understood, whether it's the SHEDS Award itself, as I say, or EBAs based off the SHEDS Award, then there's just complexity in there. So I've dot pointed a few of them. But they're just examples and different for different people. I'm cognizant of the time. There's a few things here that catch people out. Breaks between shifts is a really common one, having to allow different break times for different shift types can be a challenge. Recording those break times, recording those gaps between shifts, making sure that they're accurate and correct, making sure they're being imposed and enforced properly on the ground is a really important thing. I think we're all aware that penalty rates apply at different ways at different times, but there are quite a few different iterations of penalty rates. given the nature of the work that people do in this space, which could be in the evening, could be at the weekend, could be overnight. There's just more complexity there than, say, retail, which, you know, the timing is pretty consistent, for example. And then there's some strange, not strange things, there are some unique things that sort of flow from that happen in this space, right? So I've just called out a couple. Sleepovers are consistently problematic. Is a sleepover a break? How long should it be? How long can someone work before or after a sleepover, before they're in overtime world? What happens if they have to work during that sleepover? There's just complexity there, and the same goes for people being on call and then being recalled at times. What rates do people need to be paid just for being on call, and what happens when they have to work for that time? What if people only work for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours while they're on call? How do we handle all of that? Minimum hours for casuals, I think, is one that comes up quite a bit. Casual conversion and the right to refuse, I think that's not just an issue here, but it's an issue everywhere, and it's going to become more of a focus, and is actually more of a focus with Fair Work in the courts around how casuals are treated. And the other one that, one of the other ones at least that we see complexity around certainly is classifications under the award. You know, what role is classified in what way? And we've done a couple of jobs recently actually where, upon review of classifications, what we found is that in almost every case, for a couple of jobs recently, in almost every case, the business and organisation has classified roles or job descriptions at a higher level than if you put that same PD in front of an employment lawyer and ask them what classification should be under the award. They're coming up with a lower answer. Now, that's an example of where employers might be overpaying for the work people are doing. And there might be good reasons for that, as we said earlier, but at least understanding where your classifications sit, understanding whether you're classifying them properly to the letter of the law, whether they're over, whether they're under, and understanding that people's roles change, and those classifications need to be changed and addressed as well. I've also put down here contracts and dual roles. Now, we see quite a few, I've seen quite a few recently, certainly where people have dual roles. They spend some time doing one thing and some time doing another, and they might be different classifications or different pay rates under the award. And how you then pay those people can be a challenge. And from time to time, we see organisations adopting sort of an average pay rate that's intended to cover the higher role and the lower role, so that the individual is whole over the course of their employment for any week or month, recognising that they are doing two different things. And that's probably fine, but you just have to make sure, I think, that in that circumstance, A, it's understood, and B, you have the ability or the facility to offset any overpayments where you think you're using a higher rate to cover a lower classification for a period of time, against that you're contractually allowed to offset one against the other, if you see what I mean. So if the average rate is intended to cover a higher and a lower rate for someone who does two different things, the risk you run is that you, for the time they're working at the higher classification, the average amount you're paying them is less than they should be paid for that role, and vice versa when they're working on the other role. But if you can't offset one against the other, then the averaging thing doesn't really work, and that comes down to a contractual agreement, effectively, that you may or may not have put in place with your employee to allow you to do that. So making sure contracts allow for dual roles and have offset clauses is really important as well. And that's the point I was sort of trying to make at the bottom there, with when you have some overs and unders, which we see quite a bit. Can I offset one against the other? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but I think you need to make sure you understand them, and also understand whether your contract's drafted in such a way to give you the best chance of being able to offset those sorts of things. So as I say, there are a few examples of where we see complexity, but there's a whole heap of complexity in there. You're not all, I imagine, covered by the SHADS award. Many of you will be covered by other awards and EBAs, and there'll be other challenges there. Part of the problem sometimes is people operating under EBAs that have maybe been around for a long time. And as we said earlier, with lighter resourcing potentially in teams, the understanding, the purpose, the intent of those EBAs can sort of pass into history a little bit. Sometimes organisations can, mistakes can creep in where people aren't interpreting EBAs properly, and that can cause problems too, where you don't stay on top of those things. So it's absolutely not just the SHADS award that has a complexity in it. EBAs, we see it a bit as well, and as I say, just a few of the areas where we see that complexity. The other bulk area, I think, aside from complexity of awards or EBAs, really comes from, and I touched on this earlier, poor processes and lack of supporting technology. is probably the single biggest challenge that we face, right? When we look at these things, because all of those award things, while complex, can be understood, can be for the most part turned into rules and need to be applied, and the application of them becomes difficult. And again, I've listed here a few of those complex areas, from rostering. Who's doing your rostering? Do they understand the implications of the rostering? Are they rostering the right people at the right time in order to get maximum value from those people, and with half an eye on how much that is going to cost? Often we find that the people doing the rostering, if they're on-site line managers, may not have that full picture of how the awards or the EBAs work and the impact they might be having with their rostering. A massive sort of perennial issue when we look at these things is time and attendance recording. So obviously in a perfect world, everyone would have an automated time and attendance system, perhaps an app on their phone that they can scan or click on and click off, and it records really clearly where they are, what they're doing, how long for, when they finish their shift, when they take a break, all of those things. And that's really the holy grail for most industries, not just not-for-profit. The reality is we don't see that too much really at all, for the reasons we've already touched on. What we see much more commonly is a paper-based time and attendance system being used in a lot of cases, where employees are left to fill in a paper template to record when they've worked and what they've done, when they've slept over, when they've been on call, when they've been recalled, all of those sorts of things. And it's not uncommon for us to see in one organisation 5 or 6 or 7 different iterations of that same paper template, set up slightly differently, and being filled in slightly different ways. It's also far from uncommon for us to see sort of, what's the word, systems, informal understandings being in place, where employees trust that their line manager or payroll are going to understand what it is they put on that time and attendance paper. They'll understand what they mean, even if it's not entirely clear from what they've said. And there's then a high degree of trust placed in the person processing that time and that paper timesheet, to understand what those individuals really have been doing. And that might be fine, but as organizations get bigger, as people change, it becomes more problematic. So I think there you sort of go, the interface from that time and attendance data into payroll is really important. That issue that I just touched upon, I think is a challenge, particularly where somebody's having to manually enter manual information from time and attendance into payroll. If that's having to be keyed into a system, there's just so much risk there in terms of mistakes, errors, typing errors, understanding errors, getting that data into a system, a payroll system. Once it's in the payroll system, I don't think it's not necessarily getting easier, because then we're still relying on that payroll system to be making the right interpretations of the information it receives. Our supercodes set up properly, are overtime increases, penalty rates in there properly, those sorts of things. And then I think there's there's an additional technical payroll challenge as well, which is around tax and superannuation. Is payroll configured properly for those things? And I'll touch on super a little bit in a second. We see challenges with who is reviewing that work, given that it's potentially prone to some degree of error in there. Do we have steps in place to review it, to tick off, to make sure it's right before we finally process pay? And then you come back to the same area that I touched on before around training and education, and those resourcing risks that we see, particularly key person risk in payroll in particular, is a common problem that we see. The superannuation issue, I'll touch on it really quickly. It may have been covered before in these sessions. You may or may not be aware that the ATO allowed an amnesty for underpayment of super up until September last year. What they said was, come to us, bring us your dirty laundry, we'll help you sort it out, we'll allow you to effectively get your employees caught up on super. You won't see too much by way of penalties or admin fees or those sorts of things. And the ATO also said, but once the amnesty is finished, then we're going to go pretty hard on compliance in this space, and you can expect us to come knocking, and you can expect up to 200% penalties for any underpaid super that we find after this amnesty period is finished. Now, obviously, the amnesty period was smack bang in the middle of, I don't know, wave 2 of COVID, maybe, depending on where you are in the country. And was used to a degree, but not used as much as probably the ATO had hoped or would have liked. The ATO said subsequently, no, we understand there's been other things going on. We're maybe not going to go quite so hard on penalties as we would have, but we do intend to audit the space quite heavily and expect us to come knocking at some stage if you haven't done the right thing. And we're seeing that now. Certainly, we're helping a lot of clients deal with underpayment of super and penalties, which, while they might not be 200% penalties, it's common for us to see if the ATO audit and find underpayments of super that there'll be 110% penalties applied or 120% penalties applied. So if you underpaid $300,000 of super, you can expect a $300,000 plus penalty on top of it. It's really problematic. And I think I've listed some areas that we generally see as causing issues here. Bonuses, slightly less of an issue in not-for-profit space. Leave loading, a real common one. But poorly configured payroll codes, general codes, miscellaneous codes that have been flagged for super or not flagged for super but should be. And it's sort of passed into distant memory what those codes were set up for, and now they're being used for something different, can be problematic. So I think it's important, I think, as a discrete piece of work to make sure that your payroll system is set up properly for superannuation, and that really does involve looking at each code, understanding what it's used for, looking at how it's configured in the payroll system, and making sure that's correct against the legislation. And again, we see overs and unders here. We see organisations absolutely paying superannuation on overtime where they don't need to be. And we see unders as well, where you've then got this quite challenging disclosure process to go through with the ATO and this penalty environment, as I mentioned. So to get onto the compliance landscape and risk management a little bit, there's a few things going on here. So Fair Work obviously have been chasing these things down for the last couple of years. They're quite vocal in that. Some stats here. You know, half of the audits that Fair Work undertake, they find that 70% of those staff aren't being paid properly, with at least 30% at least showing that records aren't being kept properly. So their hit rate is pretty good, and they're doing more and more of these audits the whole time. The thing that would drive an audit from Fair Work is normally an employee complaint. Disgruntled employee is a really common way that these things sort of start, but that could also be union concerns. And what we're seeing more and more is that there's data sharing and data matching going on between different branches of government or different bodies of government, where if one spots an issue, they might go, well, hold on, that doesn't quite make sense. And if that gets to Fair Work, and that might be the ATO and super, for example, if the ATO feel like there's a super risk, then it's not beyond the realms of possibility that that finds its way to Fair Work as well. And one of the problems there is that when Fair Work start an audit, it tends to be a big activity. They'll ask for all of everything and lots of data and lots of information. So even if you've done nothing wrong, there's a lot of work to do to comply with a Fair Work audit. And what we see where organisations do have issues, we see penalties quite frequently, and we see Fair Work issue enforceable undertakings. And those undertakings, they say, well, we found you out, you've made a mistake, you've fixed the mistake, but for the next 2 years, we want you to do an audit of a percentage, 20%, 30% of your employees, to make sure that mistake isn't happening going forward. You have to go and get that audit done, you have to pay for it yourself, but the results of that audit go straight to Fair Work so they can see what's happening, which is interesting as well to me. Fair Work are to a degree outsourcing their own work there, but nonetheless that's how the enforceable undertakings work. The other thing we see is that Fair Work are pretty happy to put news and media releases out where they do penalise people. They're not shy of blowing their own trumpet in this space, that's for sure, and there's just a screen grab there from their website. I'll just touch on this really quickly. This is a Fair Work's view of what their enforcement priorities, focus areas are for 2022. Sham contracting is an important one, I think, where you've got consultants or contractors. You need to make sure they are genuinely contractors, and that's an area that's being more and more tightly constrained, both in the courts, by Fair Work, by the ATO. You can see the screen grab there really gives a flavour of the things that Fair Work are focused on. And while not-for-profits aren't on there, I sort of feel like with sham contracting, a focus on large organisations, a focus on small organisations, and a focus on vulnerable workers is kind of a pretty broad net, actually, that they're catching. So I don't think you can rule a huge number of industries or organisations out there. I think we said earlier that the altruistic nature of the not-for-profit sector maybe does provide some insulation, but this enforcement is absolutely still happening. The other thing that we see in Victoria, which is I mentioned where I'm from, is that the Wage Theft Act has come into play. A commissioner was appointed on the 17th of June, which is obviously very recently. And Victoria has made very clear that they intend to criminalise wage theft. It has been criminalised, and you can expect significant penalties and even jail time. You can see in the screen grab there where they find wage theft, deliberate underpayment to have happened. Now, what's interesting here to me is that someone's got to make a call at some stage about what's deliberate and what isn't. And to do that, an investigation has to be done from beginning to end for someone to make that determination. So in my opinion, the Victorian Wage Inspector, although they're going to go after things that are more likely to be deliberate, they're going to have to do the work, right, to make that determination. So I think that there's going to be a lot of audit activity there that maybe ultimately proves not to be deliberate, but it's still going to go through that process. And I think it's going to find its level over the next few years once the Wage Inspectorate starts to operate. We're going to see really how that happens. It's not clear at the moment how that's going to progress. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Holly, who is going to talk about a similar thing, but from a Queensland perspective.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everybody. As Ben's been discussing, the wage theft laws have just come into place or are about to come into place in Victoria. In Queensland, they were enacted last year in September. So the Wage Theft Amendment Act was brought into effect, and that made a whole lot of changes to, for example, the Queensland Criminal Code and some of the other industrial relations type legislation. One of the key things that is noted is what Ben mentioned, that deliberate intentional behaviour. So that is what the criminal code is referring to as theft, and therefore as wage theft. That's not to be confused, I guess, or to be mixed with genuine error and mistake or an accident or those sorts of things. It's very much that deliberate intentional behaviour. The penalties that's come out of this is both for employers and for individual employees as well. Say, for example, directors, senior officers, you can actually be liable for up to 10 years imprisonment if it is proven to be a criminal offence that wage theft has occurred. So I guess the penalty there is quite severe and quite scary. But again, it's very much that deliberate intentional behaviour. And like Ben mentioned, it's going to be very interesting to see how they go about that. And I think it's also interesting when you've got, say, for example, an error and mistake, which isn't intentional, it isn't deliberate. But once you identify that error, what happens then is going to lead into, again, that deliberate intentional behavior. You know, when you identify it, do you effectively and efficiently quantify that and then remediate those errors to ensure that employees are, for example, back paid all of their entitlements? I think that's going to be something else to consider moving forward in this space. And I guess another point of difference to Victoria, which I find quite interesting here in Queensland, is that the investigations for that criminal offence is actually going to be undertaken by the Queensland Police Service. So they actually, you can go online to their website and fill out the wage theft report form, and that will actually be the point where you put in a criminal complaint. So that's for anything any offences that are occurred after the 14th of September when that act did come into effect. Anything before then still follows the old processes, you know, through Fair Work and the various different commissions and industrial tribunals. But after that event, you log on to the Queensland Police Service, fill out that wage theft report, and the criminal investigation will actually be undertaken by the police from there. However, the actual recovery of wages for that employee is separate to that process and will still come under, I guess, the Queensland Industrial Relations different tribunals and councils and commissions. So there's two quite distinct processes there, and I think people being aware of that is quite key to know, especially if it's an employee who's affected, which route and path they need to do. And the website, Queensland Police, is actually quite good. It's got those guiding questions there for you to say, okay, if you want to cover your wages, go here. If you want to lodge a criminal complaint for wage theft, please fill out this form. So I think in summary, those laws are now in effect from now in Queensland, and I guess we need to ensure as an organisation that we've got a culture of compliance and making sure that if something does arise, we take swift action to remediate those errors so that we are ensuring that employees have their full entitlements. Ben?
I think that's spot on. I think that's beautifully put. I think it's clear to me that this legislation in both states it obviously wasn't put in place to catch out not-for-profits. It wasn't put in place to catch out people who unintentionally make a mistake in this area. But I think your point's a really good one, that mistake can turn into something bigger if it's not dealt with quickly. And I think it's also important just to recognise that how the investigation of these things progresses over the next year or two is going to be fascinating, I think, and a little bit scary to see who and how that happens and who it impacts.
Absolutely.
What we thought we'd do for the next little bit, and just checking the time there, is talk about some of the things that can be done. There's obviously a lot of risk management that can be done by organisations to sort of get on top of these things as much as possible. And I've dot pointed a couple, and then Holly will take us through a bit of a process that certainly has been successful in the past. So periodic compliance is sort of an obvious thing. You know, as a director on a board of a not-for-profit, it's a question that we've started to ask over the last 12 months. Where are we in this space? Are we sure? Are we really sure? Are we completely sure that we're getting this right? If your directors aren't asking at the moment, then they will be before too long, I'm pretty sure. So having to think about where this sits in your work plan, in perhaps your internal audit plan or whatever it might be, to sort of periodically be checking elements and aspects of this. And I think with that in mind, reviewing technology and business processes, as we've touched on quite a bit today, is super important. And if some of those pieces of technology are coming to the end of their natural life, there's a limit to how much I think you can band-aid those things, especially in a growth organisation, before you have to do something about it. And there's a whole host of employment law considerations. Actually, much of what we've spoken about falls in the employment law spectre here. But I think making sure that you've got a relationship with an employment lawyer and employment team, or maybe have internal support that can help you with things like interpretation of awards, interpretation of EBAs, understanding classifications is really important, and it will also help you stay up to date as to any changes that happen as well. So I think that's a really important piece. And I thought what we do now is just go through, Holly's going to take us through an approach that we've used, and an approach that's evolved over the last few years as to how we've been helping clients and dealing with these things. So Holly, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, as we know, as you've mentioned, Ben, the scope of payroll reviews and changes over the last few years has been phenomenal. And I guess with a lot of the topical issues in the media, we've had a lot of additional work come in around payroll and clients wanting to understand what their risks are, do they have any issues, that sort of thing. So we've come up with a bit of an approach and a methodology to undertake this. And as you mentioned, we've been tailoring it over time, adjusting here and there, depending on different legislation changes, like, for example, wage theft and things like that. And I thought I'd take us through it, not to be a sales pitch or anything, but just to kind of prompt some questions and to show you, you know, the common things and I guess the progression of how some of these payroll issues evolve and come to our I guess presence in an organisation. And I guess the first thing that I usually get asked is clients saying, we don't know what we don't know. And that's very true of payroll. It's so complex. There's usually only, say, for example, not-for-profits, a couple of people who really specialise in payroll and know what is what. So that's one of the questions. And another one of the questions we get is, we think it's okay, but we just want to check, you know, what should we do to make sure that we are actually complying with legislation and paying our people correctly. So this phase, this 4-phase review, it's designed to be collaborative. We really want organisations to be involved in the process, and it's also something that can be tailored and stopped and started at any point, depending on issues that kind of come up along the way. So there is a couple of gate points and things like that we use to have those discussions with clients to say, okay, is this what we expected to see? Oh, we've got an issue here. Maybe we need to pivot and change approach or tack or delve deeper into another bit of an area. So kind of phase 1 is around our payroll landscape. So this is kind of understanding what pay instruments do we have? Do we have a mix of modern awards, agreements, common law contracts? What actual entitlements do we owe to our employees? So that's basically summarising all of those different instruments, where they are at the in their progression and timeline as well. You know, is the EBA agreement that we've got in place expired? Is it in current negotiations? Has it just come in place? That sort of thing is really key to understanding what potential issues there might be, or what kind of sophistication or how old some of these issues may be that we might have to go back in time for. So it's quite good to get that kind of understanding. It's also good to understand employee classifications. So lots of different classifications under all different awards, having a look at who's under what, where should people sit, that sort of thing, getting that level of understanding. And then we like to go through all of the key processes. So that's our new starters, terminations, our pay runs, our different allowances, superannuation, and mapping out and understanding where all the key risks are, where the controls are, and do we have any gaps? And that kind of brings into the recommendations in terms of where we've got those gaps, what controls do we need to get in place to have comfort that we've got, I guess, good governance over our payroll processes. We also like to look at what systems you have in use, how are we using that system, are we using it in a mostly automated fashion? Is there a lot of manual interventions? That sort of thing can kind of lead us to, okay, there might be a lot of timesheet errors potentially because it's all manual entry. Those are sorts of questions we'd like to ask as well. And also, you know, what legal support do we have in-house? Do we rely on our outsourced legal provider, and how closely do we work with them? And another key thing we like to do as well is just have a bit of a macro look over payroll data to kind of understand what our average pay is, how much overtime, how much allowances we pay, and kind of get that level of understanding as well. So it's really understanding the entire landscape of our payroll and contextualizing then to what entitlements do we owe to our employees. So that's kind of gives us an understanding of the complexity and maturity of the payroll function and informs where we want to go next. So if there are some key risks that we identify, that might be where we want to drill down into. And so that takes us, I guess, into our phase 2. And I think Ben mentioned this earlier as well, that a lot of the time it can be around how we've set up our system, because the rules in these EBAs and modern awards can be so complex. How have we set up the system to help us ensure that we're paying people correctly, that we've got the right super flags, tax flags, all of those sorts of things. So what we generally find is the payroll system itself or software that we're using is quite good, but we're not utilizing it to the full potential. You know, we've got manual interventions where we could actually be automating that process. Other things it could be is, you know, we haven't set up those flags. We haven't put the rules in there to say, okay, this person's worked more than 12 hours this day, anything above that automatically overtime. So we might not have set things up to align with those agreements. And another key issue there is we might not have maintained the system. So if we're not putting in patches, we're not updating the system with, you know, our new rates, or when there's a change to legislation, if we're not maintaining it there, that's where we can start to have issues as well, and that can compound over time. In this phase, we really like to drill down. You know, from phase 1, we've got an understanding of what our pay instruments are, what are the key kind of entitlements that might be allowances, our pay rates, super, you know, if there's any loading, all of those sorts of things. So we go through all of those, we have a look, okay, here it says these 10 allowances that we pay, are we paying tax against them? Are we paying super? If we need to, you know, are they reportable allowances to the ATO? Have we turned that flag on? You know, other things could be not necessarily monetary straight away, but down the track, are we accruing leave appropriately? Do we have the right devices in place to say, okay, on a daily basis, this has how much leave you accrue? So we really go into the system and look at all of those setups. And we'll look at other rules as well. For example, overtime. Have we, say for example, you've got first 2 hours is 1.5 times the pay rate, but anything after 2 hours is two times. Have we actually got that rule set up to read that, to be able to pay that? That's the kind of things that we will also look at based on our summary. And in this kind of system configuration analysis as well, to round that out, it's really good to understand who's got access to the system, who undertakes what roles. Do we have segregation of duties in there? You know, one person can, you know, create a new employee, another person has to check it, or one person creates a position, but they can't also add the new employee to that position. So we look at those sorts of system access roles and responsibilities. But we also look at on an overall level, who has access to read information in the payroll systems and should they? So I guess payroll data is quite confidential. There's a lot of personally identifiable information there, and we need to be ensuring that when we access and share that information, and it's in a secure way. So we also would have a look at that sort of thing to make sure that we are in alignment with any privacy policies. So kind of at that end of that phase 2, we've got a really good overview of how everything's set up, how we potentially are paying people, and where there might be issues and errors. And this is where our first kind of gate comes into place, because depending on what we found in those first 2 phases, we'll then potentially change tack for where we want to go next. So say, for example, we identify an underpayment issue with overtime, with that rule example I provided, where after the 2 hours, we weren't actually paying double time. That might mean that we need to move to a quantification project instead, to say, okay, we need to have a look at every single employee that we paid overtime to that worked over that 2 hours. We need to go back to the start of the agreement, which might be 3 years, and we need to quantify what it is that we need to back pay to those employees and how we go about that. So that might be one path. The other path we might take is phase 3 that I've got here, which is transaction testing. So we might want to select a sample, a risk-based sample of employees to go from start to finish. How have we paid this person? Have we paid them accurately? And have we paid them in line with what their entitlements are? So that will take us all the way back to timesheets and to their work breakdown schedules and rosters to identify in a detailed line-by-line basis for those employees, have we paid them correctly? And that then can give us a really good indication of any other, say, application issues, or where, for example, we apply rules through manual intervention. Are those being applied correctly? That's because otherwise, if we take that from the system configuration, we may not identify it because that rule hasn't been configured. So this will kind of pick up any of those sort of manual intervention application of rules as well. In the phase 3 testing, we also like to get, and this is my personal interest as well, is looking at a whole lot of data. So what we'll do is we'll take any data we can get from your payroll, your master file, all of your pay runs, and we'll run some tests over that. So we have a bank of about 90 data tests that we can do over that, and that could run across and identify anomalies from you know, overtime's not being paid, or this person had a 14-hour shift but didn't get a meal break. Or, for example, there's 2 employees with the same name in our master file. Or, for example, we've got several employees with the same bank account. That can, provide indication to us that, okay, potentially there could be personal relationships here. It's quite common, husband and wife working in the organisation. Or it could be that we've got ghost employees. So those sorts of data tests can identify those outliers and anomalies to us that we can further investigate with the organisation. And another one is looking at data visualization. And I find this quite helpful as well for looking at things at a macro level. Say, for example, I like to bundle up employees into their classes, into their classifications, and have a look what allowances we're paying to all of those people. It could be, for example, that of those 10 employees, 9 of them are getting this one type of allowance, but one person isn't. So that might prompt me to think, okay, why is this one person not getting this allowance? What is their circumstance that is different? So picking out those sorts of anomalies as well is a quick way at a macro level to identify where we potentially need to look at any of those other configurations or applications of the different agreements. So that's really what that data testing is about, is really diving down and sample testing based on risk from our first 2 phases. We might have an indication of where potentially, overtime could be an issue. We might be able to then identify what it is specifically and how wide that potentially goes. So that sample testing likes to be across a cross section of employees, so we can really get the breadth and scope of the organisation. So then at the end of that kind of phase, we then take another gate or stop point to then say, okay, what have we identified in this? We might have identified from that one employee that, this particular class, we've not paid this allowance, or it could be that we've paid those 9 people an allowance they shouldn't have got. So then it's kind of at that stop point that we want to identify where to go from there. Do we need to do any more quantification for a potential back payment? Do we want to expand our sample testing? Or are we happy just to go on and move forward with making some continuous improvement, further training potentially, or anything like that? And that kind of takes us into phase 4, which is our payroll improvement plan. So this really kind of summarizes everything that we would have looked at over the whole scope. So you might have some recommendations for process improvements or segregation of duties. There might be some system configurations where we haven't flicked on a super tag, or we haven't listed something as a reportable allowance to the ATO. And we might have some other quantification issues. This payroll improvement plan, it really pulls all of that together and provides a way forward for how to go about this, because sometimes it can look quite daunting, where really, if you break it down into small chunks, it can be quite achievable. And I guess that's the whole plan as well. It's to work together collaboratively to make sure that you can correct any errors, but also continuously improve. So down the track, we know that our system is set up correctly. We know that we can pay people correctly, or we know that if we put this control or check in place, it will pick this up before it gets to this point. So that's kind of what the payroll improvement plan is all about, is to breaking it down. It might be that there's some business as usual activities, a quantification project to quantify some of those elements that need to be back paid. And it might also be that you look at system improvements or enhancements or requirements down the track. So that kind of sums up everything that we would look at. And I think it's a good overview of how to go about looking at your payroll system and really the complexity of it and all the different elements that come into play, because there could be multiple different things and not necessarily bad things as well. We've found some really great examples of some good controls that we've been able to let our other clients know, hey, what about doing this? Or we've seen this in this system, we know it can do that, maybe that can work for you. So getting that kind of perspective as well can be quite good for continuously improving payroll. So yeah, that's from me, Ben. I'll hand it back over.
No, that's fantastic. That's a really good summary. And I think just to reiterate, that is an end-to-end approach that we've taken with a number of clients that's evolved over time that we've found work well. It doesn't fit for everybody, but it might give you some food for thought around how you might want to tackle any of these issues that we've touched upon. Now, I'm super conscious that we're out of time. We've run over, so I put a little summary slide in here. I don't think I need to reiterate too much of this. I think we've dealt with the theft term and whether it is or isn't, whether that really matters and what the risks are. We've talked about some of the concern areas that we see, and probably some of them were in your mind already. We've had a discussion around the compliance activity. that we're seeing and the legislation that's starting to catch up, and my view is that we'll see more and more focus in this space as time goes on, as we come out of COVID. And then lastly, we've talked about some of the things that you might want to think about or do or assess or address to remain compliant. Now, we've had one or two questions, but what we're going to do is take them on notice, I think, and get back to people one-on-one to try and deal with some of those questions, because we are slightly over time. If you have any questions that you haven't asked, or there's anything you want to discuss, you have my contact details, or you will when you get the slide pack. You have Holly's contact details, they'll be in the slide pack too. So feel free, don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us, and we're happy to have a broader conversation about this. I believe this is the last in the current series of webinars in this space, but it has been a successful series and been well attended, so it's something that we're going to look to run again, so sort of watch the space there as well. If you have any thoughts on content you'd like to see in these webinars, then please let us know, because we're always looking for ideas about what we can present well in the future. And with that, that is it. Thank you once again. Thank you, Holly, and to everyone, have a good day. Thank you.